Hashtag she braced for death at human hands. But instead, she felt a gentle touch. The storm howled outside, its fury undiminished after 3 days of relentless assault on the abandoned research station. Wind-driven ice particles scoured the exterior walls, creating an eerie, high-pitched wail that penetrated even the most sheltered corners of the structure. Inside, the temperature hovered just above freezing, the emergency power systems having failed months ago, leaving only a few isolated pockets of functionality scattered throughout the facility. Alara huddled deeper into the nest of thermal blankets she'd constructed in a maintenance crawl space between the biology lab and the hydroponics bay. Her luminescent skin, normally a vibrant azure with delicate patterns of light pulsing beneath the surface, had dimmed to a dull gray-blue, a sign of her deteriorating physical condition. 6 months of hiding, of subsisting on emergency rations and synthesized protein paste, had taken its toll. The Xylosian female was gaunt, her once graceful limbs now thin and trembling with constant cold and fatigue. She pressed her long fingers against the wound in her side, a deep gash received 3 days earlier when a section of ceiling had collapsed during her scavenging run to the storage units. The bioluminescent fluid that served as her blood seeped slowly through the makeshift bandage, casting a faint glow against the metal walls of her hiding place. The injury wasn't immediately life-threatening, but without proper treatment, infection would eventually set in. On Viridia 4, with its hostile environment and lack of compatible medical supplies, that meant a slow, painful death. Alara closed her large, almond-shaped eyes, their usual golden glow reduced to a faint amber shimmer. She tried to focus on her breathing, a technique taught by the elders to manage pain and fear. The rhythmic meditation had sustained her through the darkest moments of her exile, through the initial flight from her homeworld, through the betrayal that had left her stranded on this frozen wasteland, through the long months of solitude and constant terror. Her people, the Xylosians, were being hunted to extinction. Their natural ability to interface with and enhance organic technology had made them valuable as slaves, research subjects, and living components in biotech weapon systems. The Coalition forces had branded them a strategic resource rather than a sentient species, effectively removing any legal protections they might have claimed. Those who weren't captured were killed outright, their bodies harvested for the unique neural tissues that facilitated their abilities. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the exterior panels, causing Alara to flinch. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her injured side. As she shifted position to ease the discomfort, her elbow knocked against something metallic partially embedded in the wall beside her. She froze, listening for any sound that might indicate she had triggered an alarm or defensive system. When nothing happened, she cautiously examined the object. It was an old emergency beacon, its casing corroded and cracked. The scientists who had abandoned the research station years ago had apparently missed it during their hasty evacuation. Alara turned it over in her hands, curiosity momentarily overriding caution. The power indicator showed a faint green glow. Somehow, the device still had a functional power source, perhaps connected to one of the few operational systems still running in the facility. Desperation and pain clouded her judgment. With trembling fingers, she activated the beacon, hoping against hope that someone, anyone not aligned with the Coalition, might be close enough to receive the signal. As the device hummed to life, emitting a weak, pulsing transmission, Alara immediately regretted her decision. The likelihood of friendly forces patrolling this remote sector was virtually non-existent. More likely, she had just broadcast her location to the very hunters she had spent months evading. But it was too late to undo what she had done. The beacon, once activated, would continue transmitting until its power source failed. All she could do now was wait. 50 kilometers above Viridia IV's turbulent atmosphere, a small, battered spacecraft drifted in a high observation orbit. The vessel, officially designated as a Harrier-class salvage ship, but modified almost beyond recognition, bore the scars of numerous hasty repairs and improvised upgrades. Its hull, once a uniform gray, was now a patchwork of mismatched panels and exposed conduits, giving it the appearance of a mechanical scavenger assembled from the remains of other vessels. Inside the cramped cockpit, Cale Ravis sat slumped in the pilot's chair, his tall frame awkwardly folded into the space designed for someone considerably smaller. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray, hung loosely around a face weathered by stress, and marked by a jagged scar that ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, stared unseeing at the swirling storm systems visible on the planet below. He absently rubbed the phantom pain in his left arm. The cybernetic replacement was functioning perfectly, but the nerve connection still occasionally misfired, sending ghost sensations of the limb he'd lost 3 years earlier. The medical technicians had assured him the phenomenon would fade with time, but like so many other wounds, this one seemed determined to remain fresh in his mind. Cale had once been Lieutenant Commander Ravis, a brilliant engineer in the Coalition's Advanced Weapons Division. His designs had revolutionized targeting systems, making orbital bombardment precise enough to hit specific buildings while leaving adjacent structures intact. He had believed the propaganda that his work would minimize civilian casualties, that surgical strikes would replace the indiscriminate destruction of conventional warfare. Until Arvith Prime, until he'd watched in horror as his technology was used to systematically eliminate an entire settlement of refugees, each strike precisely calculated to ensure maximum fatalities. Until he'd realized that his humanitarian inventions had simply made atrocities more efficient. He deserted that same night, stealing a maintenance shuttle and disappearing into the vast frontier regions beyond Coalition space. 3 years later, he survived as a salvager, collecting abandoned technology from derelict stations and forgotten outposts, selling his finds to independent colonists and frontier settlements that couldn't afford new equipment. It wasn't a good life, but it was one he could live with, most days at least. The ship's communications system emitted a soft chime, startling Cale from his dark reverie. The display indicated an incoming transmission, weak, distorted, and using an outdated emergency protocol that hadn't been standard for at least a decade. He straightened in his seat, fatigue momentarily forgotten as he adjusted the receiver to clarify the signal. Origin point, Viridia Force Surface. The computer's emotionless voice provided the information without commentary. Signal type, Emergency Distress Beacon, Scientific Core Model EC. 117, last manufactured 2185. Cale frowned. Viridia 4 was supposed to be uninhabited. The research outpost established there had been abandoned during the initial phases of the expansion conflict, deemed too remote and resource-intensive to maintain. Anyone activating an emergency beacon down, there was either in serious trouble or setting a trap for unwary salvagers. His first instinct was to ignore the signal. He had learned the hard way that altruism was a luxury he could rarely afford. Besides, the storm systems currently engulfing the landing zone nearest the transmission origin would make any rescue attempt extremely hazardous. And yet, something about the signal's weakness, its desperation, resonated with a part of him he'd thought long dead. He found himself calculating fuel requirements and atmospheric entry trajectories before he'd consciously made the decision to respond. Computer, plot course for signal origin, he ordered, his voice rough from disuse. Configure landing thrusters for high turbulence approach. As the ship's engines hummed to life, Cale wondered if he was making yet another in a long line of poor decisions. But as the vessel banked toward the storm-shrouded planet below, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important awaited him on the frozen surface. The descent through Viridia IV's atmosphere was every bit as treacherous as Cale had anticipated. The ship bucked and shuddered, warnings flashing across the control panel as winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour battered the hull. Twice, he nearly lost control entirely, the vessel spinning wildly before he managed to stabilize its flight path. By the time he reached the lower atmosphere, his hands were cramped from gripping the manual controls, and sweat soaked his thermal undersuit despite the cockpit's chilled air. The ship's external sensors provided limited visibility through the swirling snow and ice, just enough for him to identify the looming silhouette of the abandoned research station. The structure was larger than he'd expected, a central hub with 5 extending wings, partially buried under years of accumulated ice and snow. Most of the exterior lights were dark, but here and there, faint glimmers suggested that some power systems remained operational. Finding a suitable landing zone proved challenging. The station's designated landing pad was buried under a massive snowdrift, and the surrounding terrain was a treacherous maze of ice formations and hidden crevasses. Eventually, Cale identified a relatively flat area approximately 300 meters from the nearest entrance to the facility. The landing was rough, the ship's landing struts sinking deeper than expected into the deceptively soft snow, but the hull integrity remained intact. Cale spent the next hour preparing for the trek to the research station. He donned a heavy environmental suit designed for extreme cold, checked and rechecked the seals, and equipped himself with standard salvage gear. Cutting tools, portable scanner, emergency medical kit, and, despite his reluctance, a compact plasma pistol holstered at his hip. He had no intention of using the weapon, but experience had taught him that good intentions made poor armor. The journey from the ship to the station entrance was a battle against nature itself. The wind drove ice particles against his faceplate with enough force to gradually abrade the protective coating, reducing visibility with each passing minute. The snow beneath his boots alternated between treacherously slick ice and deep drifts that swallowed his legs to mid-thigh. Twice he lost his footing entirely, the gusting wind nearly carrying his relatively light human frame away before he could re-establish his grip on the guide rope he'd anchored to the ship. By the time he reached the station's emergency airlock, Cale was exhausted, his muscles burning with fatigue. The outer door, partially frozen shut, required the combined force of his mechanical arm and a pry bar to open. The inner chamber was dark and cold, but mercifully sheltered from the howling winds outside. As the outer door sealed behind him, Cale activated his suit's external lights and surveyed his surroundings. The airlock showed signs of long abandonment. A layer of frost covered every surface, and small drifts of snow had accumulated in the corners where the seal had gradually failed. But there were also more recent disturbances, faint impressions in the frost where someone had passed through, perhaps days or weeks earlier. The inner door yielded more easily than the outer one had, sliding open with a protesting screech of metal against metal. Beyond lay a long corridor, its emergency lighting functioning at minimal capacity, casting everything in a dim, bluish glow. Cale drew his scanner, calibrating it to detect heat signatures and power fluctuations. The device immediately registered the emergency beacon signal, much stronger now that he was inside the facility. It originated from somewhere deep within the station's eastern wing, the section that, according to the schematic displayed on his scanner, had once housed the biology and hydroponics laboratories. Moving cautiously, weapons still holstered but within easy reach, Cale began following the signal. The corridor branched several times, forcing him to make choices based on the scanner's increasingly precise directions. He passed through what had once been residential quarters, a communal dining area, and a small medical facility, all showing signs of hasty abandonment. Personal items left behind, equipment disconnected mid-operation, food supplies still in storage units. As he penetrated deeper into the station, Cale became increasingly certain that he was not alone. Subtle signs, a door left ajar that should have been sealed, supplies arranged in a manner suggesting recent use, a heating unit jury-rigged to draw power from emergency systems, all pointed to someone surviving here, against all odds, in this frozen wasteland. The scanner led him finally to a sealed laboratory door. The security panel beside it showed signs of tampering. Someone had bypassed the lock mechanism, allowing the door to be manually operated despite the power shutdown. Cale hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of his intrusion. Whoever was here had gone to considerable lengths to remain hidden. His arrival might be seen not as rescue, but as threat. After a moment's consideration, He decided on a direct approach. Deception would only escalate tensions if he was discovered. He rapped sharply on the metal door, the sound echoing loudly in the silent corridor. "Hello." His voice sounded strange even to himself, rusty from disuse. "I received your distress signal. I'm here to help if I can." Silence answered him. He waited, counting slowly to 30, then tried again. "I'm not with the coalition. I'm just a salvager. If you need medical assistance or evacuation, I can provide it. No strings attached." More silence. Kale sighed, recognizing the futility of his attempt. Fear was a powerful motivator for remaining hidden, especially on a frontier world where strangers rarely brought good news. He grasped the manual release for the door and pulled it open, wincing at the loud, grinding noise it produced. The laboratory beyond was dark, except for a faint, pulsing blue glow emanating from somewhere near the far wall. The room was in disarray, equipment overturned, storage units emptied, workstations dismantled for parts. Kale advanced slowly, scanner held before him, tracking the emergency beacon's signal to its source. The device led him to a narrow maintenance access panel set low in the far wall, partially concealed behind a toppled storage cabinet. The panel was slightly ajar, and from within came the soft blue glow he had noticed earlier. He crouched down, setting the scanner aside, but keeping his hands visible and away from his weapon. "I know you're in there," he said softly. "I'm going to open this panel. I'm not armed." A technical lie. The pistol remained holstered at his side, but he kept his hands empty and clearly visible. "I just want to help." Slowly, telegraphing each movement, Kale pulled the access panel open. In the narrow crawl space beyond, illuminated by the faint bioluminescent glow of her own body, Elara huddled against the far wall. Her eyes, wide with terror, reflected the light of Kale's suit lamps, giving them an eerie, golden shine. The wound at her side had worsened, the bioluminescent fluid seeping more freely now, pooling beside her in a small puddle of liquid light. Recognition dawned in Kale's eyes immediately. He had seen Xylosians before, had even worked alongside a few in the Coalition's research divisions before the expansion conflict. He knew what they were capable of, and he knew what his own people had done to them. Elara saw the human's expression change, saw the recognition, and knew that her death had arrived. She had heard the stories from the few survivors who had escaped the initial purges, tales of humans harvesting Xylosian neural tissue while the victims were still conscious, of experiments designed to amplify and weaponize their natural abilities without regard for the suffering caused. She closed her eyes, body trembling but making no attempt to flee. Where could she go? In her weakened state, with the storm raging outside and her wound steadily worsening, escape was impossible. Better a quick death at human hands than the slow agony of infection or starvation. Elara waited for the shot, the strike, the rough hands dragging her from her hiding place. Instead, she felt a gentle touch on her arm. Her eyes flew open in surprise. The human had removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face marked by a jagged scar. His expression held no malice, no greed, no scientific curiosity, only concern and a deep, abiding weariness that mirrored her own. "You're injured," he said simply. His hand moved from her arm to hover near the wound in her side, not touching it but indicating his awareness. "I have medical supplies in my pack and more on my ship. Will you let me help you?" Elara stared at him, uncomprehending. This was not how humans behaved toward her kind. Not since the expansion conflict had transformed Xylosians from allies into resources. Was this some trick, some new method of gaining compliance before the inevitable betrayal? The human seemed to sense her suspicion. He sat back on his heels, creating space between them, and slowly reached into a pocket of his environmental suit. Elara tensed, expecting a weapon or restraints, but instead, he withdrew a small thermal blanket, the kind designed for emergency use. He unfolded it with a snap of his wrists and held it out to her. "You're suffering from exposure as well as blood loss," he said. "This isn't much, but it should help until I can get you proper treatment." Still, Elara hesitated, years of conditioning and months of terror warring with her desperate need for help. The human made no move to force the blanket upon her, simply holding it out, waiting for her decision. Finally, driven by pain and exhaustion, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the offered blanket. The material was thin, but instantly began generating heat as it reacted with the ambient air. She pulled it around her shoulders, the sudden warmth making her realize just how cold she had been. "My name is Kale," the human said as she adjusted the blanket. "I picked up your distress signal from orbit. I have a ship nearby. Not large, but functional. Once you're stabilized, I could transport you somewhere safer. Somewhere with proper medical facilities for your species." Alara found her voice, and used for so long that the words emerged as little more than a whisper. "There is nowhere safe. Not for me. Not anymore." Kale's expression darkened momentarily, a flash of anger crossing his features before being replaced by determination. "Maybe not in Coalition space. But the frontier is vast, and not everyone subscribes to Coalition policies." He gestured to her wound. "Will you allow me to examine that? I have basic field medical training. It might not be ideal for your physiology, but it's better than nothing." After another moment of hesitation, Alara nodded. What choice did she really have? If the human intended her harm, he could have inflicted it already. And if his assistance was genuine, refusing it would only hasten her death. Kale retrieved his medical kit and returned to the crawl space entrance. "I need better light and more room to work. Can you move, or should I carry you?" "I can move," Alara said, her pride asserting itself despite her weakened state. With effort, she began crawling toward the opening, the thermal blanket wrapped securely around her shoulders. Kale backed away, giving her space to emerge on her own terms. When she finally exited the cramped maintenance tunnel, he offered his arm for support, but did not touch her until she hesitantly accepted the assistance. Together, they moved to a nearby workbench that Kale quickly cleared of debris. Alara sat on its edge, the thermal blanket still clutched tightly around her, as if it might shield her from more than just the cold. Under the brighter light of the laboratory, Kale could see the true extent of her injuries. The gash in her side was deep, the edges showing the faint phosphorescent glow that indicated the beginning of the xylosian healing process. But the glow was weak, suggesting her body's resources were too depleted to properly address the wound. "This needs cleaning and sealing," Kale said after his examination. "I have antiseptic and synthetic skin in my kit. It's designed for human physiology, but the basics should work for you as well. The real concern is infection. Bacterial compatibility can be an issue between species." Alara nodded. "Our immune systems are adaptive, more so than yours. If the wound is clean, my body should be able to manage the rest, given time and proper nutrition." Kale worked methodically, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency, applying antiseptic that made Alara hiss with pain, and finally sealing the gash with strips of synthetic skin that adhered to her unusual epidermis better than he expected. Throughout the process, he maintained a professional demeanor, explaining each step before he took it, asking permission before touching new areas, treating her not as a specimen or resource, but as a patient deserving of dignity and respect. When he had finished, he packed away his supplies and stepped back, giving her space. "The seal should hold, but you'll need antibiotics and proper nutrition to fully recover. I have some emergency rations on my ship that might be compatible with your digestive system." He paused, then added, "That is if you're willing to come with me." Alara studied him, still wary, but no longer expecting immediate violence. "Why are you helping me? You know what I am. You know what the Coalition would pay for my capture." Kale's expression hardened. "I know exactly what the Coalition would pay, and I know exactly what they would do with you afterward." He unconsciously rubbed his cybernetic arm, the memory of his own complicity a constant weight. "Let's just say I'm no longer interested in Coalition rewards." He turned away, ostensibly to gather his equipment, but actually to give himself a moment to control the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained facade of calm competence. When he turned back, his expression was once again neutral. "Night is falling, and the storm is getting worse. We should stay here until morning. Attempting to reach the ship in current conditions would be too risky. I have emergency supplies enough for the night." He glanced around the laboratory, Is there a more defensible location within the station? Somewhere with better temperature control, perhaps. Alara considered the question. After months of hiding in the station, she knew its layout intimately, including which areas still had functional environmental systems. The central hub, she said finally. The emergency generators, they're still operational. I've been scavenging parts to repair the heating system. It's not comfortable by your standards, but it's warmer than here. Kale nodded. Lead the way, then. I'll bring the medical supplies in case we need to change your dressing during the night. Their journey to the central hub was slow, Alara still weak from blood loss, and Kale careful not to rush her. They passed through darkened corridors and sealed pressure doors, Alara guiding them through shortcuts and hidden access ways that didn't appear on standard schematics. The central hub, when they reached it, was indeed marginally warmer than the outlying laboratories. Alara had created a small living space in what had once been the station's control center. A nest of salvaged blankets and padding occupied one corner, while a modified heating unit hummed softly nearby, drawing power from the emergency systems. A collection of scavenged food packets and water containers was neatly arranged on a former workstation, and various tools and spare parts were organized with careful precision on another. You've been surviving here for some time, Kale observed, taking in the makeshift habitat with professional appreciation for its functionality. Impressive adaptation. Alara shrugged, the gesture causing her to wince slightly as it pulled at her freshly sealed wound. Necessity. After my escape pod crashed, this was the only shelter within reach. I had hoped to repair enough systems to send a proper distress signal, but you couldn't be certain who would answer, Kale finished for her. And a proper signal might have attracted the wrong kind of attention. Yes. She sank onto her nest of blankets, the brief journey having depleted her limited reserves of energy. The beacon was an act of desperation. The wound was worsening. I knew I couldn't survive much longer without help. Kale nodded, understanding. He set his pack down and began extracting supplies, additional thermal blankets, emergency rations, a portable heating unit that would supplement the one already functioning. We should eat something, then rest, he said. Tomorrow, we'll make for my ship, assuming the storm has abated enough for travel. Alara watched him warily as he prepared a simple meal from his rations, dividing it carefully between two field containers. When he offered one to her, she accepted it with visible hesitation. It's not poisoned, Kale said, a hint of dark humor in his voice. If I wanted to harm you, there are far more efficient methods. That's not as reassuring as you might think, Alara replied, but she began eating nonetheless, her body's needs overriding her lingering suspicion. They ate in silence, the only sounds the howling wind outside and the soft hum of the heating units. When they had finished, Kale collected the empty containers and stowed them in his pack. You should sleep, he said. Your body needs rest to heal. I'll keep watch. Alara eyed him skeptically. You need rest as well. The journey through the storm couldn't have been easy. Kale shrugged. I've operated under worse conditions. Besides, old habits die hard. I haven't slept deeply in. He trailed off, then finished simply in a long time. Alara studied him for a moment, then shifted slightly in her nest of blankets, making room. There's space enough for two, and share body heat is more efficient. You can rest while remaining alert. I know something about survival under threat as well. After a moment's consideration, Kale nodded. He removed the outer layer of his environmental suit, but kept the insulated undersuit on, then carefully settled into the space Alara had made, maintaining a respectful distance. They lay in silence for a time, backs to each other, each acutely aware of the other's presence. The storm raged outside, but within their small island of relative warmth, a fragile peace had been established, built not on trust, which neither could afford to give freely, but on mutual recognition of the other's humanity, despite their different species. Eventually, Alara's breathing slowed and deepened as exhaustion claimed her. Kale remained awake longer, his mind racing with contingency plans and calculations of risk. But eventually, the warmth and the relative safety, the first he had experienced in longer than he cared to remember, lulled him into a light doze, his subconscious remaining vigilant even as his conscious mind surrendered to rest. The storm continued through the night and into the following day, forcing Kale and Alara to remain in the relative safety of the central hub. The extended confinement created an unexpected opportunity, or perhaps necessity, for conversation. Initially halting and filled with careful omissions, their exchanges gradually became more substantial as hours stretched into a full day. Kale spoke first of practical matters, his ship's capabilities, possible routes away from Viridia for colonies and outposts where Xylosian might find, if not welcome, at least absence of immediate threat. Alara responded with equal pragmatism, sharing information about the research station systems, the resources she had cataloged, the patterns of the planet's deadly weather. But as the hours passed, their conversation inevitably touched on deeper matters. "You were coalition military," Alara observed during a lull, her golden eyes fixed on Kale's cybernetic arm, which had been adjusting with a small toolkit. "That prosthetic is standard issue for officers, though usually better maintained." Kale's hands stilled momentarily. "Yes, Lieutenant Commander, Engineering Corps, Advanced Weapons Division." He resumed his work, eyes focused on the delicate calibration. "Until 3 years ago. What changed?" The question was direct, unembellished. Kale was silent for so long that Alara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, as if reciting facts about someone else. "I designed targeting systems, precision guidance for orbital bombardment platforms. The technology was supposed to minimize civilian casualties, allow for surgical strikes against military targets only." His jaw tightened. "At least, that's what I told myself." Alara waited, sensing there was more. "They used my systems at Arvith Prime, a refugee settlement, officially classified as an insurgent stronghold in the reports, but that was a lie. There were civilians there, families, children." The calibration tool trembled slightly in his hand. "My technology made it possible to target individual buildings, individual rooms. Made it possible to ensure that no one escaped. Maximum efficiency." He set the tool down with careful precision. "I watched the feed from the targeting cameras. Watched what my work made possible. Then I left. Stole a maintenance shuttle, erased my access codes, disappeared into the frontier." His eyes met Alara's, challenging. Not a very heroic defection. Just couldn't be part of it anymore. Alara absorbed his confession without visible reaction. After a moment, she spoke, her voice equally measured. "My people were researchers, primarily. Biological sciences, agricultural development, medical technology. When we discovered our ability to interface directly with organic technology, to enhance and direct biological processes through a form of neural symbiosis, we thought we had found a way to advance healing, to restore damaged ecosystems, to feed starving populations." A bitter smile crossed her features. "When the Coalition approached us with offers of partnership, we believed we would be working toward those goals together." She shifted position, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her healing wound. "By the time we realized what they actually wanted from us, living components for bioweapons, neural tissue for organic computing systems, test subject for military enhancement procedures, it was too late. They had already established bases on our world, already identified and cataloged those of us with the strongest abilities. Some of us escaped during the initial roundups. I was part of a group fleeing to neutral space, seeking asylum. Our ship was damaged in an engagement with Coalition forces. The escape pod scattered. Mine crashed here." She gestured to the station around them. "I don't know if any of the others survived." Kale absorbed her story, recognizing in it the same pattern of betrayal and exploitation that had characterized so many Coalition partnerships during the expansion conflict. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words entirely inadequate but sincerely meant. Alara met his gaze. "You were part of the system that destroyed my people. Now you're helping one of its victims. Humans are complicated. Not complicated, just inconsistent in our principles," Kale replied. "Some better than others. Most just trying to survive without thinking too deeply about the structures they're supporting. He resealed the access panel on his cybernetic arm, the calibration complete. I was one of those for too long. Their conversation lapsed into silence, both processing what had been shared. Neither had revealed everything. There were omissions, selective emphases, details held back out of ingrained caution, but enough truth had passed between them to establish a fragile foundation of understanding, if not yet trust. The following morning brought a temporary break in the storm. The wind had died down to manageable levels, and while snow still fell steadily, visibility had improved considerably. Kale, after checking the weather conditions via his suit's sensors, determined that they had a viable window for traveling to the ship. "We should move now," he told Alara, who was looking considerably stronger after a night of proper rest and nourishment. "The storm is cyclical. This break might last 6 hours or only 1. We can't afford to wait." Alara nodded, already gathering the few possessions she deemed essential: tools, data storage devices containing her research and observations, a small pendant that appeared to be her only personal item. Kale noticed, but did not comment on how little she chose to take, how easily she prepared to abandon the place that had been both her prison and her sanctuary for months. "Can you manage the trek?" he asked, eyeing her wound with professional concern. "It's about 300 meters through difficult terrain. The synthetic skin is holding, but internal damage might be aggravated by exertion." "I'll manage," Alara said simply, wrapping herself in the thermal blanket he had provided. "The alternative is staying here until the next supply ship arrives, which, from what I've gathered, is approximately never." Kale almost smiled at the dry humor, unexpected in their circumstances. He helped her into an environmental suit salvaged from the station's emergency supplies. It was designed for humans and hung loosely on her more slender frame, but it would provide essential protection against Viridia IV's hostile atmosphere. They departed the research station through the same airlock Kale had entered 2 days earlier. Outside, the world was a study in whites and grays, the falling snow softening the harsh angles of ice formations and partially burying the guide rope Kale had left anchored to the ship. "Stay close," Kale instructed, securing a safety line between their suits. "If visibility drops suddenly, which it can, this will keep us together. Follow the guide rope. Test each step before putting your full weight down, and alert me immediately if you feel any unusual pain or weakness." Alara nodded, her face barely visible behind the environmental suit's faceplate. Without further discussion, they began the arduous journey toward the ship. The trek proved even more challenging than anticipated. The temporary lull in the storm had allowed fresh snow to accumulate without being compacted by wind, creating a deceptive surface that gave way unexpectedly under their weight. Twice, Alara stumbled into snow drifts deep enough to reach her waist, requiring Kale's assistance to extract herself. The third time, the effort of freeing herself caused her wound to reopen partially, the pain sharp enough to make her gasp. Kale heard the sound through the suit's communication system. "You're injured again," he said, not a question, but an observation. "We need to keep moving. The ship's just ahead. Can you continue, or do you need me to carry you?" "I can continue," Alara insisted, her pride evident even through the distortion of the comm system. But her next steps were unsteady, her breathing labored. Kale made a quick decision. "Conserve your strength," he said, and before she could protest, he had lifted her with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest, her relatively light weight manageable even in the difficult conditions. Alara stiffened momentarily, then relaxed, recognizing the practicality of his action. "This is more efficient," she conceded, allowing herself to be carried the remaining distance to the ship. The Harrier-class vessel, partially buried by fresh snowfall, appeared as they crested a final ridge. Kale felt a surge of relief at the sight. Despite its battered appearance, the ship represented their only chance of escape from this frozen wasteland. "Home sweet home," he muttered, more to himself than to Alara. He carefully descended the ridge, each step calculated to maintain balance while carrying his injured companion. The ship's external access ramp had deployed automatically when heat approached during his arrival, but was now partially blocked by accumulated snow. "I need to set you down briefly," he told Alara, gently lowering her to stand beside him. "Hold on to my arm while I clear the ramp." Using his cybernetic arm, Kel quickly cleared enough snow to allow them passage. The effort was taxing in the thin, cold air, but the urgency of their situation provided ample motivation. Once a path was cleared, he helped Alara up the ramp and into the ship's small airlock. As the outer door sealed behind them and the decontamination cycle began, Kel removed his helmet, encouraging Alara to do the same. The air inside the ship was noticeably warmer, though still cool by human standards. For Alara, whose species evolved on a warmer world, it was barely comfortable. "The environmental controls are set low to conserve power," Kale explained, noting her discomfort. "I'll adjust them once we're inside." The inner door opened, revealing the cramped interior of the salvage vessel. What had once been a standardized military layout had been extensively modified to accommodate Kale's solitary lifestyle and professional needs. The cockpit remained largely unchanged, but the crew quarters had been converted into storage for salvage materials, while the small galley and common area had become a combination workshop and living space. "Not exactly luxurious," Kale said with a hint of self-consciousness as he helped Alara to a seat near the central heating unit. "But it's functional and off the grid. Coalition patrol ships don't bother with vessels this size unless they're near restricted areas." Alara sank gratefully into the seat, her strength finally flagging after the difficult journey. "It's better than a frozen research station," she said, her voice weak but tinged with genuine relief. "Much better." Kale busied himself with practical matters, adjusting the environmental controls to a temperature more suitable for Xylosian physiology, retrieving medical supplies to redress her wound, preparing a nutrient solution that would be compatible with her biological needs. His movements were efficient, practiced, suggesting long experience in managing crises with limited resources. As he worked, Alara took in her surroundings with keen interest. The ship's interior told a story about its owner that his words had not. Scattered among the tools and salvaged parts were small, seemingly insignificant items that spoke of a life beyond mere survival. A leather-bound book, actual paper in an age of digital displays, a small potted plant, somehow thriving in the artificial environment, a roughly carved wooden figure representing some kind of bird in flight. These touches of humanity amid the utilitarian environment suggested depths to Kale that he kept carefully hidden, perhaps even from himself. He returned with fresh medical supplies and knelt beside her. "I need to check your wound. The trek likely caused some damage to the temporary sealing." Alara nodded permission, and he carefully removed the outer layer of her borrowed environmental suit. As expected, the synthetic skin had partially detached, allowing the bioluminescent fluid to seep through. "Not as bad as it could be," Kale assessed, "but it needs cleaning and resealing before we leave atmosphere." He glanced at her face, noting the increased pallor and the dimming of her natural luminescence. "And you need nutrients. Your body is depleting its reserves trying to heal." He worked quickly but gently, removing the damaged synthetic skin, cleaning the wound again, and applying a fresh seal. This time, he added a reinforcing layer of medical adhesive designed for internal injuries. "This is meant for human tissue," he explained as he worked, "but the principle should translate. It creates a flexible matrix that supports the natural healing process while preventing additional damage from movement." When he had finished with the wound, he handed her a container of thick, bluish liquid. "Nutrient solution. I synthesized it based on what I know of Xylosian biochemistry, which isn't comprehensive, but it should provide the basic building blocks your system needs." Alara accepted the container with murmured thanks and sipped cautiously. The taste was strange, but not unpleasant, slightly sweet with an underlying mineral tang. "It's good," she said, sounding faintly surprised. "Better than the emergency rations I've been subsisting on." "Military-grade synthesizers," Kale said with a shrug. "One of the few benefits of salvaging coalition equipment." They're designed to produce nutrition compatible with most known sentient species. He didn't add that such adaptability had been engineered primarily to support occupation forces on newly conquered worlds, not out of any humanitarian consideration. As Alara continued to drink the nutrient solution, Kale moved to the cockpit and began the pre-flight sequence. The ship's systems responded sluggishly at first, components stiff from exposure to the extreme cold, but gradually warmed to operational status. "Where are we going?" Alara asked from her seat in the main cabin, her voice stronger now as the nutrients took effect. Kale paused in his preparations, considering the question carefully. It was one he'd been pondering since he'd first found her. "There's an independent trading post in the Eridan sector," he said finally. "Freeport 7. It's technically within coalition jurisdiction, but it's remote enough that enforcement is minimal. The population is mixed: humans, Tyresians, Vrel collectives, even a few Xylosians, last I heard. Not many questions asked as long as you follow local protocols." He turned in his seat to face her directly. "It's not perfect. There's always risk, but it's far enough from major trade routes that you might be able to establish a new identity, maybe connect with others of your kind. From there, wherever you choose." Alara considered his suggestion. "You seem familiar with places that exist in shadows. Places for those who need to disappear." Kale's expression remained neutral. 3 years of avoiding coalition entanglements teaches you where the blind spots are, also where the traps lie. He returned his attention to the navigation console. "We should leave soon. The atmospheric window won't last much longer." Alara nodded, understanding his reluctance to elaborate further. She finished the nutrient solution and carefully set the container aside, then moved gingerly to the co-pilot's seat. If Kale was surprised by her choice to join him in the cockpit, he showed no sign of it. "I'll monitor the environmental readings," she offered. "I've become quite familiar with Viridia IV's atmospheric patterns." Kale nodded agreement, and they began the launch preparations together, falling into an unexpectedly smooth working rhythm. When the ship finally lifted off, rising through swirling snow toward the temporarily clear sky above, both felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at escaping the frozen planet, apprehension about the uncertain journey ahead, and a strange, tentative sense of possibility that neither was quite ready to examine closely. As the small vessel broke free of Viridia IV's atmosphere and entered the relative safety of open space, Kale set course for the Eridan sector. The journey would take approximately 4 days at maximum sustainable speed, long enough for Alara's wound to heal significantly, if not completely, and for both travelers to consider what their futures might hold. The first day passed in relative silence, each adjusting to the other's presence in the confined space, establishing unspoken boundaries and routines. Kale occupied himself with ship maintenance and course calculations, while Alara rested and explored the vessel's limited confines, examining Kale's collection of salvage technology with evident interest. By the second day, the awkward silences had begun to give way to more natural interaction. Shared meals provided opportunity for casual conversation, initially focused on practical matters, but gradually expanding to include personal history, cultural differences, and even philosophical discussions about the nature of conflict and cooperation between different species. "Your understanding of Xylosian culture is more nuanced than I would have expected," Alara observed during one such conversation. They were seated in the small galley area, sharing a meal of synthesized protein and hydroponic vegetables that Kale cultivated in a small chamber near the engine room. Kale paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "I worked with several Xylosian engineers before the expansion conflict, primarily on environmental systems rather than weapons." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Dr. Naren used to say that humans designed with force while Xylosians designed with flow. He claimed it was why your environmental systems were so much more efficient than ours. You worked with natural processes instead of trying to dominate them. "Naren Tvalis?" Alara asked, her luminescence brightening momentarily in surprise. "You knew him." "We collaborated on atmospheric regulators for deep space installations." Kale's expression darkened. I lost track of him when the conflict began. Coalition intelligence classified all Xylosian personnel as subjects of interest. Many disappeared overnight. Alara was quiet for a moment. Dr. Tvalis was my mentor at the Science Academy. He was among the first taken for special research projects. We never saw him again. Her voice held a complex mixture of grief and anger. His theories on sympathetic biological systems formed the foundation of my own work. I'm sorry, Kale said simply. After a moment, he added, he was a good man. Brilliant mind. He deserved better. Alara studied him thoughtfully. You speak of him with genuine respect. Not as a resource or asset, but as a colleague. A person. That's what he was, Kale replied. The simplicity of his statement highlighted the gulf between his personal perspective and the Coalition's official position on non-human sentience. Their conversation lapsed into contemplative silence, but something fundamental had shifted. A connection had been established, tenuous but real, built on shared respect for someone they had both valued. On the third day, as they passed through a particularly dense asteroid field that provided useful cover from potential Coalition patrols, the ship's long-range scanners detected an approaching vessel. The craft was still too distant for identification, but its trajectory suggested it was actively patrolling rather than simply passing through. Coalition? Alara asked, tension evident in her voice as she joined Kale in the cockpit. Can't be certain yet, he replied, fingers moving quickly over the sensor controls. But this particular route is known to smugglers and fugitives. The Coalition occasionally sends patrols through to maintain the illusion of control. He glanced at her. We should prepare for the possibility. They worked quickly, converting one of the hidden storage compartments Kale used for particularly valuable salvage into a shielded hiding place for Alara. The space was cramped and uncomfortable, but its walls were lined with material that would mask her life signs from standard scanners. It's not perfect, Kale warned as they finished the preparations. A thorough inspection would find you, but for a routine patrol, it should be sufficient. Alara examined the small space with resigned acceptance. I've hidden in worse places. As the unknown ship drew closer, its identity became clear. A Coalition patrol cutter, interceptor class, typically staffed by a crew of 6 to 8. Its firepower significantly outmatched Kale's modified salvage vessel, though the smaller ship had advantages in maneuverability. They're hailing us, Kale said, his voice carefully neutral as the communication system chimed. He looked at Alara. You should hide now. I'll handle this. Alara hesitated briefly, then placed her hand on his shoulder, the first time she had initiated physical contact between them. Be careful, she said simply, then retreated to the hiding place, sealing herself inside. Kale composed himself, adopting the slightly irritable, independent salvager persona he had cultivated over the years. When he activated the communication system, his face revealed nothing of his inner tension. Salvage vessel Cerulean Fox responding, he said, using the ship's registered name rather than its military designation. Identify yourself and state your purpose. The screen flickered, revealing the stern face of a Coalition patrol officer. This is Lieutenant Merrick of Coalition Patrol Vessel Vigilant. You are in restricted space. Salvager, identify yourself and prepare for boarding and inspection. Kale's expression registered calculated annoyance rather than alarm. Restricted space? Since when? I've used this route for 3 years without issue, and my permits are current. The officer's eyes narrowed. Coalition Security Directive 15 to 87, issued 2 months ago. All traffic through the Kargan asteroid belt requires special authorization due to increased smuggling activity. A thin smile. If your permits are current, as you claim, you have nothing to worry about during our standard inspection. Kale's mind raced. A full inspection would inevitably discover Alara, regardless of their precautions. He needed to avoid boarding at all costs, but outright refusal would only escalate the situation. I'm transporting time-sensitive materials for delivery to Freeport 7, he improvised. Medical components. Any delay could compromise their efficacy. He fixed the officer with a steady gaze. I'm sure you're familiar with Directive 29 to 12 regarding priority passage for essential medical supplies, even those bound for independent territories. It was a gamble. Directive 29 to 12 did exist, but it was an obscure regulation, rarely invoked and easily overridden by security concerns. However, it would require the patrol officer to actively choose to delay medical supplies, a decision that would require documentation and potential review. Lieutenant Merrick frowned, clearly caught between procedural requirements and bureaucratic caution. "Transmit your manifest and permit documentation," he ordered. Cale complied immediately, sending carefully prepared files that he kept specifically for such encounters. Legitimate permits for his salvage operation, along with a fabricated but convincing manifest listing various medical components and synthesizer elements. Long seconds passed as the officer reviewed the documents. Finally, he spoke, his tone grudging. "Your permits appear to be in order, and the manifest corresponds to authorized trade goods. However, you should be aware that Security Directive 15 to 87 supersedes commercial convenience. In the future, obtain proper clearance before entering restricted areas." Cale managed to look simultaneously relieved and irritated. The reaction of a business operator inconvenienced but not seriously impeded. "Understood, Lieutenant. I'll update my navigation charts accordingly." "See that you do." The officer's eyes remained suspicious, but without clear cause for boarding, he was reluctant to delay a shipment that, if legitimate, would reflect poorly on him if compromised. "Proceed on your registered course to Freeport 7. Be advised that additional patrols operate in this sector. Maintain proper identification protocols at all times. Acknowledged, Vigilant. Cerulean Fox out." Cale terminated the connection and immediately adjusted their course. Not drastically enough to appear suspicious to the watching patrol ship, but sufficient to maximize the asteroid field's cover. Only when the patrol cutter had moved beyond sensor range did he release a long, slow breath and go to release Ilera from her hiding place. She emerged looking pale but composed. "Coalition security protocols have intensified," she observed quietly. That officer was young but thorough. 3 years ago, they wouldn't have bothered with a vessel this size. "The net is tightening," Cale agreed grimly. After the Relakian uprising, the Coalition began implementing stricter control measures, especially in frontier regions. What was once merely claimed territory is becoming actively enforced space. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of barely contained stress. "We need to adjust our route. The direct path to Freeport 7 will likely have additional checkpoints." Ilera moved to the navigation console beside him, studying the star chart displayed there. After a moment's consideration, she indicated an alternative route. "Here, through the Veres Nebula. Sensor distortion would provide cover, and the radiation levels, while higher than ideal, are within tolerable limits for short exposure." Cale examined her suggestion with professional assessment. "It adds almost a day to our journey, and the nebula's particulate density will strain the engines." He glanced at her. "But you're right. It's safer than risking another patrol encounter." He adjusted their course accordingly. "Good thinking." The compliment, delivered with straightforward professional respect rather than condescension, earned a brief smile from Ilera. Navigation was part of basic education on Xylos. Our early space exploration required precise, celestial calculations due to limited fuel reserves. "Useful skill," Cale commented as he finalized the course adjustment. He hesitated, then added, "We make a decent team." The simple observation hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to articulate. The shared crisis had accelerated. Their transition from wary strangers to reluctant allies, but the future remained uncertain. Once they reached Freeport 7, their paths would likely diverge, Ilera to seek others of her kind or establish a new identity among the station's diverse population, Cale to return to his solitary existence as a salvager operating on the fringes of Coalition space. Yet the thought of that separation left both with an unexpected sense of loss, as if something valuable would remain unfulfilled. The nebula crossing proved more challenging than anticipated. The Cerulean Fox's navigational systems struggled with the dense particulate matter, requiring manual adjustments and constant monitoring. Kale and Alara worked in shifts, one always at the controls while the other rested. During one such shift, while Kale slept briefly in the small bunk he'd rigged in the main cabin, Alara noticed an anomalous reading on the sensor display. At first, she dismissed it as interference from the nebula, but as the pattern repeated, she recognized it as artificial, a transmission being relayed through the nebula's particulate matter, using the natural radiation to mask its source. Coalition forces used similar techniques to coordinate patrol movements in areas where conventional communications might be detected by those they hunted. But this signal pattern didn't match Coalition encryption sequences. It was something else, something familiar. When Kale awakened, Alara showed him what she had discovered. "It's a Xylosian emergency coordination signal," she explained, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Modified to use the nebula's radiation as a carrier wave. My people developed this technique for communicating when conventional methods were being monitored." Kale studied the data with cautious interest. "You think there are other Xylosian refugees nearby?" "It's possible." Alara's luminescence had brightened with hope. "The signal is weak and fragmented, but the pattern is unmistakable." She hesitated, clearly torn between hope and caution. "If we adjusted our course toward the signal source, we might be able to establish contact." The request remained unspoken but clear. Kale considered it carefully, weighing the potential risks against Alara's evident desire to connect with others of her kind. "It would mean deviating from our planned route," he said finally, "extending our time in the nebula. And if it is other Xylosians, they may not welcome a human presence." "They would welcome you if I explained your role in my rescue," Alara countered. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, the second time she had initiated contact between them. "Please, Kale, I need to know if others survived." Kale looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, seeing the hope and determination there. After a moment, he nodded. "We'll investigate, but cautiously. If there's any sign of Coalition presence or other danger, we withdraw immediately." Relief and gratitude washed over Alara's features. "Thank you." They adjusted course toward the signal's origin, navigating carefully through increasingly dense regions of the nebula. As they drew closer, the transmission clarified, resolving into a repeating pattern that Alara identified as coordinates for a rendezvous point, along with a simple authentication code. "It's legitimate," she confirmed after analyzing the complete signal. "And recent. The timestamp indicates it's been active for less than a week." Her voice held tightly controlled emotion. "They're looking for survivors." The rendezvous coordinates led them to a small planetoid on the nebula's far edge, little more than a large asteroid with a breathable but thin atmosphere. Its surface was barren and rocky, dotted with deep crevasses and cave systems that would provide excellent concealment from orbital scans. As they established orbit, sensors detected a small encampment nestled within one of the larger cavern systems. The energy signatures were deliberately minimal, designed to blend with the planetoid's natural radiation patterns, but Alara confirmed they matched Xylosian technology. 3 ships, she reported, studying the readings. "Small vessels, similar to yours in size. Life signs, approximately 20 individuals." Her voice faltered slightly. "Xylosian life signs." Kale watched her reaction with understanding. After believing herself potentially the last of her kind, the confirmation of other survivors represented a profound shift in Alara's reality. He gave her a moment to process before asking gently, "Do you want to make contact?" She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion constricting her throat. Kale opened a communication channel and transmitted the authentication code Alara had identified in the emergency signal. Seconds stretched into minutes with no response, and Alara's hope began to fade. Perhaps the code was outdated, or the survivors too cautious to respond. Then the communication system activated, displaying a visual feed of a male Xylosian whose skin glowed with patterns similar to Alara's, though his luminescence was stronger, suggesting better health. "Identify yourselves," he demanded, his standard heavily accented but clear. His expression was wary, hostile even, until Alara moved into view beside Kale. "Alara Chan, xenobiologist, Xylo Science Academy," she said formally. "Registration number XSA 7291. The male Xylosian's demeanor transformed instantly, his luminescence pulsing with what Kale recognized as joy or excitement. "Alara, we received your escape pod's automated distress beacon months ago, but when we investigated, there was no sign of you, only crash debris. We believed you had been captured or killed." "I survived the crash," Alara explained. "Found shelter in an abandoned research station. I was injured recently and activated an emergency beacon." She glanced at Kale. This human responded. "He treated my wounds and helped me escape when Coalition forces approached the planet." The Xylosian's gaze shifted to Kale, suspicion returning. "A human helped you?" "Willingly." "Yes," Alara said firmly. "Without his intervention, I would have died. He risked his own safety to provide assistance, knowing what I am." There was a pause as the Xylosian seemed to confer with others off-screen. Finally, he returned his attention to the communication. "We will transmit landing coordinates. You are both welcome among us." The words were polite, but his expression when looking at Kale remained guarded. As the transmission ended, Kale raised an eyebrow at Alara. "That was less than enthusiastic. Perhaps it would be better if I remained with the ship while you reunite with your people." Alara shook her head emphatically. "No, they will understand once I explain." She met his gaze directly. "You've earned a place among us, Kale. At least for now." The landing coordinates directed them to a concealed hangar area within the largest cavern system. As Kale guided the ship to a careful landing, they could see the small Xylosian encampment, a collection of modular shelters arranged around central communal areas, with the 3 ships Alara had detected positioned strategically for quick departure if needed. A small group awaited them as they disembarked, 5 Xylosians led by the male who had spoken to them during the communication. His name, they soon learned, was Talon, once a navigator on a Xylosian research vessel, now the elected leader of this band of refugees. The reunion was emotional. Alara was embraced by the group, their skin luminescence synchronizing in patterns Kale recognized as a cultural greeting among their kind. She knew several of the refugees personally, colleagues from the Science Academy, crew members from her evacuation vessel. Their joy at finding her alive was evident even to Kale's human perceptions. He remained slightly apart, aware of his status as an outsider, and more critically, as a member of the species responsible for hunting these people. Some of the Xylosians cast wary glances in his direction, while others openly stared, likely having had little direct contact with humans outside of violent encounters. Alara, however, made a point of including him. As the initial greetings subsided, she formally introduced him to the group, emphasizing not only his role in her rescue, but the fact that he had deserted the Coalition over ethical objections to their policies. "Kale is not our enemy," she stated firmly. "He represents the possibility that not all humans support the Coalition's actions. He deserves our respect and gratitude." Talon, still clearly skeptical, nevertheless extended a formal greeting. "Any friend of Alara's is welcome among us. We have little to offer in terms of comfort, but we will share what we have." The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions and explanations. The Xylosian refugees had established a temporary haven on the planetoid while gathering resources and information for a longer journey to the outer territories, where Coalition influence was minimal. They had been monitoring communication channels and establishing contact with scattered groups of survivors, gradually building a network that might eventually form the nucleus of a new Xylosian society. As night fell, by the planetoid's short rotation schedule, the refugees gathered for a communal meal in the central area of their encampment. Kale found himself seated next to Alara, with Talon and several other leaders of the group nearby. The food was simple, synthesized proteins and nutrients similar to what he had prepared for Alara on his ship, but the atmosphere was surprisingly convivial despite the circumstances. Conversation flowed more freely as the meal progressed. The initial wariness toward Kale gradually diminished as Alara recounted their experiences in greater detail, and as Kale himself answered questions about coalition movements and security protocols with candid helpfulness. Your knowledge of coalition patrol patterns has significant value, Talon observed during a lull in the conversation. Combined with our understanding of the outer territories, it could substantially improve our chances of reaching safety. Kale nodded acknowledgement of the implied question. I'm willing to share whatever information might help, though I should warn you that my intelligence is not comprehensive, and some of it may be outdated. Even so, Talon pressed, your experience as a navigator through contested space would be invaluable. He exchanged glances with several of his compatriots before continuing. We would welcome your continued assistance, if you were willing to provide it. The invitation, though carefully phrased as a request for information, clearly extended beyond the immediate moment. Talon was suggesting that Kale might join their journey to the outer territories, not merely as a temporary ally, but as a member of their group. Kale hesitated, caught off guard by the offer. His gaze moved unconsciously to Alara, who watched him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Hope, perhaps, or simple curiosity about his response. I need to consider the implications, he said finally. My current existence has a certain simplicity. Joining your journey would mean committing to something larger. Talon nodded, accepting the non-answer with good grace. Of course, it is not a decision to be made hastily. He rose, signaling the end of the formal meal. Rest tonight. We can discuss possibilities tomorrow. As the gathering dispersed, Alara and Kale were shown to separate sleeping quarters, small but comfortable spaces within the modular shelters. Before they parted, Alara paused. You don't have to stay, she said quietly. You've already done more than could be expected. No one would think less of you for returning to your own path. Kale studied her face, trying to discern what she truly wanted. And what about you? What do you want me to do? Alara's luminescence dimmed slightly, a sign of emotional intensity among her people. I want you to make the choice that brings you peace, Kale. You've carried enough burdens not of your own choosing. She reached out, her slender fingers lightly touching his scarred cheek in a gesture of simple affection. Whatever you decide, know that you have earned something rare, the trust of those who had every reason to fear your kind. That alone is a victory against the hatred the coalition has tried to sow. With that, she withdrew to her quarters, leaving Kale to contemplate a future far more complex than the solitary existence he had envisioned for himself just days earlier. He spent much of the night in restless contemplation, weighing options and examining motivations. The coalition deserter in him recognized the strategic value of continuing with the Xylosian refugees. His knowledge could indeed improve their chances of successful relocation. The salvager in him noted the practical disadvantages: increased risk, divided resources, compromised independence. But beneath these rational considerations lay something deeper, something he had denied himself since his desertion: connection. Purpose beyond mere survival. The possibility of belonging to something meaningful again. By morning, he had reached a decision. The Xylosian refugees had gathered for a planning session when Kale joined them. Conversations quieted as he entered, all eyes turning toward him with varying degrees of curiosity and caution. Alara sat among her people, but separated herself slightly to make room for him beside her. A small gesture, but symbolically significant. Talon acknowledged Kale's arrival with a nod. We were discussing potential routes to the outer territories. Your perspective would be valuable, if you're willing to share it. Kale took the offered seat beside Alara and studied the star chart displayed on the portable projector in the center of the gathering. After a moment's examination, he pointed to a particular sector. The coalition has increased patrols here, along the Catarn trade route, he began. It's the obvious path, which makes it the most dangerous. But there's an alternative. He indicated a less direct route through several sparsely populated systems. The Velos Corridor, technically within coalition space, but minimally patrolled due to resource constraints and limited strategic value. As he outlined the advantages and challenges of the proposed route, Kale became aware of the shift in the group's attention, from skeptical tolerance to genuine interest. They asked questions, offered suggestions, engaged with his knowledge in a collaborative exchange that felt surprisingly natural. When the technical discussion concluded, Talon addressed the unspoken question directly. "Have you reached a decision about joining our journey, Kale Ravis?" Kale straightened, his gaze moving briefly to Alara before addressing the group as, I have. If you'll have me, I believe my skills and knowledge would be useful to your endeavor." He paused, then added with unexpected honesty, "And I find myself reluctant to return to solitude after these past days." A murmur ran through the gathering, not disapproval, but surprise and cautious acceptance. Talon exchanged glances with several others before responding. "Your assistance would indeed be valuable," he acknowledged. "And perhaps there is meaning in this unlikely alliance, proof that connection remains possible even across the divisions the Coalition has created." He extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement, a deliberate choice that Kale recognized as significant. "Welcome among us, Kale Ravis." As Kale accepted the handshake, he felt Alara's presence beside him, her quiet approval a counterweight to the uncertainty of the path ahead. The journey to the outer territories would be fraught with danger, the future beyond it unclear. But for the first time since his desertion, he was moving towards something rather than merely away from his past. Later, as preparations for departure began in earnest, Kale found a moment alone with Alara on the edge of the encampment. They stood side by side, looking out over the barren landscape of the planetoid, the nebula visible as a luminous cloud in the black sky above. "Are you certain about this?" Alara asked softly. "Joining us changes everything for you. The Coalition already considers you a deserter. Aiding Xylosian refugees would elevate your status to active enemy." Kale's expression remained calm. "I've been an enemy of the Coalition since the moment I left. The only difference now is that I'm choosing to act on that opposition rather than simply hiding from it." He turned to face her directly. "Besides, I made a promise when I found you in that maintenance crawl space to get you somewhere safe. Until that's accomplished, my job isn't finished." Alara smiled, her luminescence brightening. "You've more than fulfilled any obligation, Kale." "Perhaps," he conceded, "but I find I want to see this through." He gestured to the encampment, where the refugees were methodically preparing for their journey. "Your people have something the Coalition tried to destroy: compassion, cooperation, hope for a future built on mutual respect rather than domination. It feels right to be part of preserving that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the unspoken connection between them acknowledged without need for elaboration. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges the journey might bring, they would face them together, along with the community that had formed around them. As they turned back toward the encampment, Alara slipped her hand into Kale's, a simple gesture that bridged worlds and histories. He glanced down at their intertwined fingers, then at her face, illuminated by her natural glow and the nebula's light. "Ready?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than their immediate return to the group. Kale nodded, tightening his grip slightly on her hand. "Ready." Together, they walked back toward the ships that would carry them and their unlikely alliance toward an uncertain but hopeful horizon, a future neither could have imagined when a desperate signal had brought them together on a frozen, forgotten world at the edge of known space. In that moment, both understood that what had begun as a rescue had transformed into something far more significant: redemption, connection, and the first tentative steps toward healing wounds that had seemed beyond repair. Not just their personal wounds, but perhaps, in some small way, the wounds between their peoples. The preparations for departure continued over the next 2 days. The Xylosian refugees worked with practiced efficiency, dismantling their temporary settlement and loading essential supplies onto the 3 small vessels that would carry them to the outer territories. Kale's ship, the Cerulean Fox, would join their small convoy, its superior sensor capabilities and Kale's knowledge of Coalition patrol patterns providing an additional layer of security for the journey. Alara divided her time between assisting her people with the evacuation and working with Kale to integrate their navigation systems. Her wound had healed considerably, her natural bioluminescence returning to a healthier glow as her strength increased. The change was both physical and psychological. The discovery of other survivors, the prospect of building a new community beyond Coalition reach, and perhaps most significantly, the unexpected alliance with Kale had restored a sense of purpose and hope that months of isolated hiding had nearly extinguished. Kale, too, had changed. The rigid self-containment that had characterized his initial interaction with Alara had gradually softened. He still carried the weight of his past actions, the guilt of his complicity in Coalition atrocities, but he had begun to see a path toward atonement, not through solitary penance, but through active contribution to something worthwhile. On the morning of their planned departure, Kale was making final adjustments to the Cerulean Fox's sensor array when Talon approached. The Xylosian leader had remained cordial but distant since accepting Kale into their group, clearly reserving judgment until he could be certain of the human's commitment. "Your ship's modifications are impressive," Talon observed, studying the unconventional arrangement of sensor nodes with professional interest. "Military training with salvagers' adaptability, an unusual combination." "Necessity breeds innovation," Kale replied, tightening a connection with his cybernetic hand. "Coalition sensors are designed to detect standard configurations. These adjustments create a signature that registers as background radiation rather than an active scanning system." Talon nodded appreciatively. "Clever." He hesitated, then continued in a more personal tone. "I must admit, I had reservations about your inclusion in our journey. Humans have not been allies to our people in recent years." Kale paused in his work, turning to face the Xylosian directly. "Your reservations were justified. I was part of the Coalition machine, even if I eventually rejected it. I understand skepticism. And yet Alara trusted you immediately," Talon said, his tone suggesting this remained somewhat puzzling to him. "She is not usually so quick to form attachments." Kale considered this information, thinking back to their first encounter in the abandoned research station. Alara terrified, expecting death, yet somehow finding the courage to accept his help despite everything she had experienced at human hands. "Not immediately," he corrected gently. "She expected me to kill her when I found her. It was only after—" He paused, searching for the right words. "After we recognized something in each other. Something broken by the same system, perhaps." Talon's luminescence pulsed in a pattern Kale had come to recognize as thoughtful consideration. "The shared experience of disillusionment," he suggested. "You both believed in something larger than yourselves, only to discover corruption at its core." "Something like that," Kale agreed, surprised by the Xylosian's insight. Talon was silent for a moment, then said, "She speaks highly of your integrity. Her judgment has always been sound." He extended his hand in the human gesture they had established as their formal greeting. "I believe we are fortunate to have you with us, Kale Ravis." Kale accepted the handshake, recognizing it as more than a simple courtesy. It was acceptance, perhaps even the beginning of trust. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'll do my best to justify that belief." As Talon departed, Kale returned to his work with renewed focus. The final preparations were nearly complete. By midday, their small fleet would be ready to depart for the outer territories, beginning a journey that would take them through some of the most dangerous regions of space. Areas heavily patrolled by Coalition forces, territories disputed by rival factions, and lawless zones where pirates targeted vulnerable travelers. The risks were substantial, but for the first time in years, Kale felt the weight of isolation lifting. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them not alone, but as part of something meaningful, a community bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. As the final loading procedures were completed and pre-flight checks initiated, Kale took his position in the Cerulean Fox's cockpit. Alara had elected to travel with him rather than on one of the Xylosian vessels, a choice that had raised a few eyebrows among her people, but had been accepted without comment. She settled into the co-pilot's seat with a familiarity that suggested it had somehow become her natural place. Navigation systems aligned with the convoy, she reported, her fingers moving confidently across the control surfaces. Communication channels established and encrypted. Cale nodded, completing his own pre-flight sequence. Engines at optimal capacity. Sensor array active, but in passive mode to minimize detection signature. He glanced at her. Ready. Alara's expression was serene, but determined. Ready. The four ships lifted off in perfect synchronization, rising from the planetoid's surface into the embracing darkness of space. As they cleared the thin atmosphere and established formation, Talon's voice came through the communication system. Course set for the Velos corridor. May fortune and skill guide our journey. A brief pause, then more personally, Cerulean Fox, you have point position. Your sensors are our best early warning system. Acknowledged, Cale responded. We'll keep you informed of any anomalies. The small fleet accelerated away from the planetoid, leaving behind the temporary haven that had sheltered the Xylosian refugees. Ahead lay a journey measured not just in light years, but in challenges overcome, bonds strengthened, and perhaps, eventually, a new beginning beyond the reach of those who would deny their right to exist freely. As the ships entered the nebula that would conceal the first leg of their journey, Alara reached across the small space separating her from Cale, her fingers lightly touching his arm. No words were necessary. The gesture conveyed everything: gratitude, solidarity, and a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that had formed between them against all probability. Cale covered her hand with his own for a brief moment before returning his attention to the ship's controls. Together, they guided the Cerulean Fox deeper into the nebula, leading their unlikely convoy toward a future neither could have imagined when a desperate distress signal had first brought them together on a frozen, forgotten world. The journey would not be easy. Dangers awaited them, challenges that would test their resolve and resourcefulness. But they had already survived what should have been insurmountable: Alara's months of isolated hiding on a hostile planet, Cale's years of solitary atonement for his past. Together, they had found something neither expected: not just survival, but the possibility of redemption, of purpose, of connection. As the nebula's swirling clouds enveloped their ships, obscuring them from outside detection, Alara looked out at the luminous patterns that reminded her, distantly, of the bioluminescent forests of her lost homeworld. The sight brought not pain but a strange peace, an acceptance that while some things were irretrievably lost, new beginnings remained possible. Not replacements for what had been, but different paths, equally valid, equally meaningful. It's beautiful, she said softly, indicating the nebula's glowing tendrils. From a distance, it looked chaotic, threatening. But from within, she gestured to the intricate patterns of light and shadow visible through the view screen. There's an order to it, a harmony. Cale followed her gaze, seeing the nebula through her perspective. Like many things that appeared dangerous from a distance, he observed, understanding changes perception. The simple philosophy applied to more than just their current surroundings. It encompassed their journey from enemies to allies, from isolated survivors to members of a community, from fear to something approaching trust. As the Cerulean Fox led the small convoy deeper into the nebula's concealing embrace, both Cale and Alara understood that what had begun with a desperate act of kindness, a gentle touch instead of violence, compassion instead of fear, had created a ripple effect beyond their individual lives. Their alliance, unlikely as it seemed, represented a small but significant rejection of the hatred and division that the coalition had sought to instill. In that, perhaps, lay the seeds of a larger healing, not just for themselves, but for the wounded relationship between their peoples. It was a beginning, fragile but real, carrying them forward into a future where differences might be celebrated rather than feared, where connection might replace conquest, and where gentle touches might overcome the legacy of violence that had separated them for too long. The stars awaited, and beyond them, possibilities limited only by their courage to imagine them. And so the journey continued, not an end, but a beginning, a path forward that neither could have foreseen when Alara, wounded and desperate, had braced for death at human hands, only to feel instead the gentle touch that had changed everything.